Well, good evening, everybody. Once again, I'm sorry that I could not be there in person, but once again, you hopefully have the next best thing. You've got me live on video. When you are working through this, I will actually be on a plane to Houston, and I will be back in a few days. I'm going to a National Science Teacher Conference and excited about that opportunity. But as we are 2 short weeks away from Easter, I wanted to be with you tonight in whatever way I could because I wanted us to look at a couple of very specific things to kind of get us ready for what's coming. Now, first and foremost, I wanted to remind everybody I put this on our page on Facebook, and I've also put it on my personal Facebook page. So I would please encourage everybody to go and share this, share it to your social media, let people know that you know on April the 9th, we are going to be hosting here at Cross Church the debate between Dr. Mike Licona and Dr. Bart Ehrman on the resurrection. Whether or not the resurrection of Jesus Christ was an actual historical event, is there evidence to actually show that this is the case? Dr. Licona very much believes that it is, and Dr. Ehrman wants to bring up evidence where he says that it was not. And so they're going to go for the longest debate that I've ever seen. The debate's going to last from 8:30 in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon. We are going to have it here at Cross Church. We're going to be able to see it. It's going to be in the parlor. We'll start gathering about 8 a.m. on Saturday, April the 9th. If you can come and you want to be there for the whole time, we want you to be. If you can only come for a little while, then we want you to be here for whatever time you can. We will talk about how we can maybe do lunch together if they give us a lunch break, or if we're going to order something in, we're working on that too. But we want everybody that wants to be there to be there. So invite whomever you want to. I know we've invited a couple of other churches. We've sent word out to a few different places to tell people that this is going to happen, that we're going to host it. So once again, Saturday, April the 9th, we're going to start at 8 o'clock. The debate will begin at 8:30. And then the debate will end about 3:30 that afternoon. This is a debate on the resurrection of Jesus Christ with Dr. Mike Licona from Houston Baptist University and Dr. Bart Ehrman. With that in mind, and with Easter less than 2 weeks away, tonight I wanted us to look at a very specific piece of the Easter story. Tonight we're going to look at the crucifixion. Now, I've sent ahead some handouts that I hope everybody's got. There's a couple of different PowerPoint presentations, and there is a document from the Journal of the American Medical Association that some of you may have read, some of you may not have. But we're going to look at the crucifixion tonight from a couple of different avenues, because the question that we need to focus on, the question is, did Jesus really die on the cross? Now, I bring that question up because it is vital to the resurrection story. It's vital to the Easter story. There are many people. There are people in the Christian tradition. There are people in outside the Christian tradition who do not believe that Jesus Christ actually died on the cross. In fact, Muslims do not believe that Jesus died on the cross. Muslims believe that God took him away and put someone else on the cross and made them look like him so that Jesus would not die on the cross. But you have to remember, if there is no death, if Jesus did not die on the cross, then there would be no resurrection. There would be no raising from the dead. And we're going to take a look at a few issues about all of that. I've got a couple of different PowerPoints presentations that I have available to you, and I'm going to jump around a little bit, and then we're going to take a look at a video together that someone has put together about the specific medical issues that come up when we talk about crucifixion. So if you have read the article about the physical death of Jesus Christ, then some of this will be familiar to you. But if you haven't, then some of this may be brand new. And so I want to give you as much of a background as I can before we begin that. And then, of course, you're going to have all the time in the world to read through all the material that I've sent ahead. So I just want to look through a couple of things really quickly. And you'll forgive me because I'm kind of working with a couple of different screen issues here. But in terms of history, looking at Tacitus, who is a Roman historian, he writes in AD 15 about Christus, who the Christians were named after. And there were references to the crucifixion as the most extreme penalty, and that a movement based on a crucified man could not be explained. This is part of the history of what we've got in terms of Jesus and the cross. Then when Pliny the Younger, writing in about AD 111, there were Christians that were executed just for being Christians. And so the history of people that are going to their death because of their belief in both the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus is very well documented. You've got three here: Thallus, Tertullian, and Phlegon, all making reference to the darkness spoken of during the crucifixion. Some of them try to explain it away, but it is discussed as a cosmic event. So we're looking at biblical history and biblical things that are talked about that are being referenced by other writers. There are many different writers, Jewish writings, where Jesus was referenced as a miracle worker and a healer. Then there are about 7 different things that we can gather from extra biblical evidence that we know about Jesus. First, that he was a Jewish teacher. People believe that he healed others and he cast out demons. Some people believed he was the Messiah. He was rejected by the Jewish leaders. He was crucified under Pilate. His followers believed he was alive and spread all the way to Rome by AD 64, and people worshiped him as God. But right there is number 5. That's the one we're going to be focused on tonight. The fact that even our extra biblical evidence about Jesus says that he was crucified under Pilate. So now what we have to do, and we've got some more references than just these, but now what we've got to do is we've got to decide, okay, if we know he was crucified, then we have to decide, was he actually dead? Did the crucifixion kill him? Now, please make no mistake. If at any time you need to stop and you've got a place where you think somebody's got a question, or if anybody in the room's got a comment, then by all means, stop this. I'll be right there in the corner just going, and, stop it, talk about it, and then keep moving. Whatever you get through, you get through. Whatever you don't, go back and watch it later, because I'll post this later on. But when we look at theories about the crucifixion and the resurrection, a couple things actually do come up. Now, when I taught this a few years ago, looking at the resurrection theories and some of the answers to that, we used this acronym, FEAT, FEAT. And the first letter of this acronym is F, and it stands for the fatal torment of Jesus. Now, you're going to hear a lot more about this in a few minutes, but there are a lot of things that different scientists and different doctors and medical specialists have put into discussion about what it was that actually would have killed Jesus on the cross. And so some of the different medical issues that you're going to hear in a little while are hematoidosis, the idea that your capillaries can break open and blood will seep into your sweat glands. This comes from severe trauma to the body, and mostly sometimes psychological as well. Of course, they're going to talk about the Roman flogging, the scourging. You've seen it in the movies, but there were leather whips with metal balls and bone fragments attached to them. The flesh would have been destroyed. Sometimes even spine and bones would have been exposed during the beatings. Jesus would have probably suffered from what we know of as hypovolemic shock. His heart would have worked way too fast because of the severe blood loss. And the nail actually going through the wrists, not the palms, as most people, throughout history have tended to say, but some medical experts have actually tested that theory. And there's no way that a nail going through a palm, even if you're holding up both, it's going to hold the human body. It's just not going to happen. They're just going to slip right through. But going through the wrists, you're going to see some evidence of the nail going through the wrist and where it would actually crush the median nerve, which would have caused excruciating pain. And you also have to remember that in the ancient world, the idea of a hand was actually from the tip of the finger all the way down to about where you'd wear your watch. So nail going through the wrist would have been absolutely possible, given what we know about crucifixion. Going nails through the feet, crushing similar nerves. You can do this without breaking certain bones. In fact, you can do it without breaking any bones. There are some who believe that his shoulders were dislocated. Some doctors and medical personnel think that either asphyxiation or even respiratory acidosis, meaning too much carbon dioxide in the bloodstream, might have caused or been a possible cause of the death, a possible heart attack. We're going to hear a little bit about that here in a few minutes. And then, of course, when we look at the spear piercing his side with the blood and water flowing, some scientists have said, oh, well, the idea there, and I used to think this too, that spear may have punctured the heart, the sac around the heart being pericardial fluid, that coming out first. But since then, and since the articles have been written, the one from the Journal of the American Medical Association, there have been other tests and other studies that have been done, and it looks like there's an even better explanation than that, that deals with the decreased ability for the blood in Jesus's body to coagulate. And so there are going to be some explanations about how that works as well. So I want you to give a good listen when we get to that. There are a lot of reasons why people are giving that Jesus should have died and would have died on the cross. Now, just to skip ahead a little bit, we've got discussions on the empty tomb and how he appeared and the transformation of the disciples. But I want you to see this. There are many theories out there about what happened that is not about the death of Jesus. For example, there is a swoon theory where some people say he only appeared to die, but he didn't really. This has been debunked time and time again, but it comes back up again every couple of years. There are people who say the disciples lied about everything. There are people, in fact, it's called the Passover plot. There are people throughout all of Christian history who say that the disciples stole the body. There are some people who say the women went to the wrong tomb, and that's why they could believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. There are people who believe in hallucinations, group hypnosis. There are people who say, like I said before, somebody else was crucified instead of Jesus. There's one theory that says Jesus had a twin brother, and that twin brother was the one put to death. Muslims believe that God put the visage or the likeness of Jesus on someone else, possibly Judas, and he was the one crucified. The Jehovah's Witness religion does not allow for a physical resurrection at all. And so there's a link here, and you'll be able to get to that through the digital version of this. I'll make sure that that's posted for you too. So there's a lot of different reasons why people have throughout the years said that this couldn't be possible. The resurrection wouldn't be possible because Jesus didn't actually die. So what I want us to do now is I want us to kind of step back and I want us to listen to an explanation about the medical issues surrounding a crucifixion. Remember, the goal for tonight, and not just tonight, but the goal for us, first of all, is to really decide once and for all, did Jesus actually die? Because if he died, then we can move forward and we can say, okay, now we have to deal with, was he raised from the dead? This is why we celebrate Easter. This is what we believe to be true. This is what the scripture tells us. But it is a question that keeps coming up again and again and again. Did he really die? And in fact, we've seen movies on TV and we've seen movies in the theater that want to say that it was just a spiritual resurrection and not an actual physical resurrection. But once again, if you've got no death, then you've got no resurrection at all. So we have to deal with the death issue, because if he didn't go to the cross, then he couldn't have come out of the tomb. So let's take a look. And also, actually, before I get to that video, I've got another document here that is going to go through some of what I just talked about, and it's called They Crucified Him. I took this from a different website, a different researcher, and I will have this there for you as well. I do believe you've already gotten it. And as we go through, there is a discussion, a cause of Jesus' death. There are theories about asphyxiation. There's been a reevaluation of that. There's a very good book by Dr. Zagibi, and I can't remember his first name right off the top. Frederick, it's right there on the screen, called The Crucifixion of Jesus, a Forensic Study. Very interesting book. There's a couple of different books out there. You're going to hear about another one here in a minute on the video. But Dr. Zagibi talks about hypovolemic shock. He talks about internal hemorrhaging. We know that Jesus' legs weren't broken based on what the scripture tells us, but the piercing of the side. This is the interesting discussion here. And Dr. Anthony Sava actually rejects the conclusion about the heart being punctured and the pericardial sac. He talks about the trauma caused by all the scourging would have led to specific conditions where the blood would have actually not coagulated, but the different elements in the blood, the red blood cells, would have settled to the bottom of where the fluid had gathered around the lungs and the heart. And so when he was punctured, the darker material with the red blood cell would have come out first, and then the lighter, clear serum would have then come out after. So we'll get into some more of that later. And I know this is a lot, and it's probably more of a science lesson and a medical history than some people want. But this all goes back to our question once again. Did Jesus actually die on the cross? So we're going to take a look together at this video. It's called How Did Jesus Die on the Cross? Or How Did Jesus Really Die? And we're going to watch this together, and then we'll chat a little bit when it's over. This one is a short video, and once again, there are places where we can pause as we go through. So let me kind of make that a little bit bigger. And here we go.
The misconceptions regarding the Bible that we inherit from others can be so heavily ingrained in church culture that we sometimes fail to question them. For example, how many wise men visited Jesus when he was born? I'll give you a moment to think about it. The answer most commonly given is 3. This answer, however, is incorrect. The only gospel to mention the wise men is Matthew, and Matthew gives no particular number. So why does 3 seem like the right answer? Most likely because Matthew records 3 distinct gifts offered by the wise men: gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So, let me ask you another question. How did Jesus really die? You'd be right to answer crucifixion, but crucifixion was only the instrument or manner of Christ's death. What was the actual cause? To answer this, we'll take a deep dive into the historical context of the crucifixion through the eyes of a medical doctor. This is a medical examination of the cross.
You can question the wise men thing later if you want to.
To start, it's important that we understand some of the historical context. This video won't address the events or reasons leading up to Christ's trial, conviction, and crucifixion, but we will take a closer look at the historical practice of Roman scourging and crucifixion. Matthew 27:26 reads, "Having scourged Jesus, Pilate delivered him to be crucified." Crucifixion was prefaced by scourging, either on the way to the cross or before the victim began the trip to the cross. Tied to a post, the condemned person would be beaten with the flagellum, a leather whip with metal knotted into its thongs. This whipping bloodied the victim's back, leaving strips of flesh hanging from the wounds. In ecclesiastical history, Eusebius writes, "Bystanders were struck with amazement when they saw them lacerated with scourges even to the innermost veins and arteries, so that the hidden inward parts of the body, both their bowels and their members, were exposed to view." After the grisly scourging, Christ would have had his arms outstretched and tied to a plank of wood called the patibellum. Having stretched out both of his arms and fastened them to a piece of wood which extended across his breasts and shoulders as far as his wrists. The patibellum had an estimated weight of 60 pounds, 27 kilograms, and would become the horizontal piece of the cross.
Okay, very quickly. Right here in the corner, you see Dr. Joseph Bergeron, his book, The Crucifixion of Jesus, and a medical examination of the crucifixion. Excellent book also. And again, some of this material, there are claims that are made, and they have a lot of interesting facts to back them up, but some of them are also theories. So it bears discussion, and it bears us looking into.
After fixing Christ's arms to the patibellum, he was led up to the place of his crucifixion, Golgotha, Aramaic for the place of the skull, or in Latin, Calvary. The criminal was then thrown to the ground on his back, with his arms outstretched along the patibellum. His hands could be nailed or tied to the crossbar, but nailing, apparently, was preferred by the Romans. The archaeological remains of a crucified body, found in an ossuary near Jerusalem and dating from the time of Christ, indicate the nails were tapered iron spikes, approximately 5 to 7 inches, 13 to 18 centimeters long, with a square shaft of 3/8 inch, 1 centimeter across.
You can see here, this is a reference to the article that you have from the American Medical Association Journal back from 1986, and the images that you see behind him are also there as well.
Nails commonly were driven through the wrists rather than the palms. A nail through the mid-palm could potentially be unstable and pull through the flesh between the fingers from the force of the victim's body weight, but a nail placed through the wrist bones, carpal bones, or above the wrist would be stable and hold the victim on the cross. After being fixed to the patibellum, Jesus would have been hoisted onto the vertical part of the cross, also known as the stripes. This is where another common misconception occurs, namely the shape of the cross. While most depictions of the cross are a lowercase t shape, also known as a crux immensa, it is far more likely that the cross of Christ was an uppercase T shape, also known as a crux commissa. Crucifixion was a frequent practice that made the more complex structure of the cross immensa impractical for routine use. Many extra-biblical sources also suggest the uppercase T-shaped cross being the standard for crucifixion. Besides an impractical structure, there was also a problem with the weight of the crux immensa. On average, a fully assembled crux immensa was 300 pounds, 136 kilograms. The idea that prisoners condemned to crucifixion would be expected to carry a cross of this weight seems highly unlikely. With reasonable certainty, Jesus was crucified on a crux commissa, a T-shaped cross, having a height of 6 to 8 feet. Jesus would have been eye to eye with his executioners while hanging on the cross. The long vertical piece of the cross, the stripes, was permanently fixed to the ground. Soldiers lifted the patibellum with the attached victim up onto the stripes. The patibellum was held in place on top of the stripes by a mortise and tenon joint. The feet were then nailed to the stripes. Nails piercing the top of Jesus' feet may also be an artistic invention. Archaeological evidence suggests it may actually have been common practice to hammer a nail through the heel.
Now, one thing to keep in mind, some of the details that he's talking about here, and you can read all about a lot of this in the articles that I've given you. Some of the details that he's talking about here, people will say things like, "Well, if it wasn't this, and you can tell me it's that, then doesn't that negate what you're saying in the first place?" And the answer is really no. Does it really matter, truthfully, if the nail went through the top of the foot instead of the side of the foot? No, it truly doesn't, because that's a detail that the gospel writers don't put in the gospels. We do not have in the gospels, an exact description of where the nails were put, except we know that in his feet and hands. So we're looking at archaeological evidence, and we're looking at historical evidence about what we know on crucifixion to try to piece this together. And a lot of people don't do this. A lot of people don't think about it from that perspective because, and like he said, whether you agree with him or not, he is right in that there are a lot of things that are tradition that many people don't question. And the questioning is not a bad thing. But questioning without wanting to get an actual answer, that's where we get into problems. We want to get real answers because, trust me, the real answers, the actual truth of what takes place, makes this all the more real as we discuss the actual death of Jesus.
Prolong the crucifixion process. A horizontal wooden block or plank serving as a crude seat, sedile or sedulum, often was attached midway down the stripes. Only very rarely, and probably later than the time of Christ, was an additional block, supedenium, employed for transfixion of the feet. For 6 hours, Jesus hung on the cross. It was often customary for Roman soldiers to break the legs of those crucified to hasten their death. But when they arrived to find Jesus, he was already dead. Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. There was no doubt that Jesus was dead. Roman military was well known for their violence and expertise in execution. It was often the case that if a condemned prisoner escaped, or if a soldier failed to perform his duty of execution, that the soldier himself would take the place of the prisoner, giving great incentive to ensure the death of those condemned. This is evidenced in Acts 16:21. When the jailer woke and saw that the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. Since the exact moment of death by crucifixion was uncertain, executioners could ensure death by a spear thrust into the victim's side, such as was dealt to Jesus. The extent of Jesus' tortures was such that he could never have survived the crucifixion and entombment. Clearly, the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, and supports the traditional view that the spear, thrust between his right ribs, probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium and heart, and thereby ensured his death. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge.
Now remember, that article was written back in 1986, and even then, whether they got the conclusions right or wrong, they were still able to say that everything that we know about the human body, everything that we know about what happened in crucifixion, is going to point to the fact that when Jesus came off that cross, he was dead. Now, let's make no mistake, and let's remember, we are talking about Jesus Christ. We are talking about the very Son of God, the one who was before us, the one who is with us, and the one who will be to come. We know that this person, this man, this God-man, Jesus Christ, was different from everybody else, but we know he was 100% human as well as God. And so we can be very clear and we can be very certain based on what we're looking at that the humanness of him, that very 100% human nature of him, that human body that was him on this cross, based on everything that we've looked at so far, had to die on that cross.
Historical context in view, we can now move on to the medical commentary on details regarding the sweating of blood, fluid deprivation, the severity of Jesus' beatings, the effects of scourging, lung injury, signs of shock, the water and blood from the spear thrust, and the actual cause of Christ's death. The night before the crucifixion, Jesus and the disciples ascended the Mount of Olives, and Jesus prayed fervently to the Father about what was about to take place. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Sweating blood, called hematidrosis in medical terminology, is a rarely observed phenomenon. It is the spontaneous discharge of blood through the skin, sweating blood. The rarest form of hematidrosis is single episode psychogenic hematidrosis and is associated with the fear of death prior to execution. There are only a handful of reported cases of this kind. That Jesus sweat blood indicates he had clear understanding of the horror he was about to experience. It is interesting that only Luke, a physician, wrote about Jesus sweating blood. He must have considered it a significant detail. During times of emotional distress, sweating is increased due to the increased elevated circulating catecholamines, hormones made by the adrenal gland, in the blood. This is caused by sympathetic nervous system activation and commonly called a fight or flight response or an adrenaline rush. A high state of anxiety and sweating would contribute to dehydration. Jesus would have been without food or water for at least 12 hours prior to being placed on the cross. We can safely assume that Jesus would have been deprived of anything to eat or drink after his arrest. Symptoms of dehydration could include thirst, dry mouth, headache, dizziness, confusion, muscle cramps, and heart palpitations. Roman scourging caused blunt trauma, contusions, and lacerations all over the body. This would have caused significant blood loss from the cuts and tears in the flesh, as well as bruising from blunt trauma. Scourging and blunt trauma to the chest wall can cause injury to the lungs. In traumatic hemorrhagic shock, seemingly the case with Jesus, shock occurs from decreased circulating blood volume due to injury and bleeding. Symptoms can include confusion, lightheadedness, feeling cold or clammy, weakness, and extreme thirst. The spear would have entered Jesus' chest wall between the ribs. Pleural effusion, fluid around the lung, generally has a clear appearance and would be described as water by someone in the ancient world. When the spear ruptured the heart, blood would mix with the fluid in the chest and give the appearance of blood emanating from the chest wound.
Are you starting to get a real picture now? I hope you are. Like I said before, even if some of the conclusions are not as well supported as others, all of what we have in front of us, what we're looking at here, the documents I've given you, gives us a much clearer picture, a much more dramatic picture, a much more brutal picture of what was going on the cross. And this says nothing about the spiritual implications of what was going on at the cross.
As mentioned earlier, crucifixion was only the instrument or manner of death. What was the actual cause? Could it be cardiac rupture, the spear thrust to the chest, suffocation, or was it something else entirely? Let's take a closer look at some of the most popular theories, started with what is certainly the most poetic, namely, a broken heart. Interestingly, in more recent times, it has been found that severe emotional distress can affect the heart muscle. There is a rare condition called Takotsubo, stress-induced cardiomyopathy, sometimes called the broken heart syndrome. This condition occurs after extreme stress. It temporarily weakens the heart muscle and actually causes the heart to balloon or dilate. When this occurs, the heart is unable to beat properly and causes symptoms indistinguishable from a heart attack. However, Jesus does not fit the profile of patients suffering from this syndrome. Only 3% of those affected by Takotsubo stress-induced cardiomyopathy are under age 50, and cardiac rupture is thought to occur in less than 2% of these patients. Patients are typically over age 50, 90% are female, and those affected generally have a good prognosis for recovery in the absence of any underlying cardiac disease. The most common cause of cardiac rupture is a heart attack. In medical terms, myocardial infarction. Heart attacks occur when a clot, thrombosis, occurs in an artery providing blood to a portion of the heart muscle. A heart attack would be very unlikely in a healthy male in his early 30s. Is it possible that Jesus survived up until the last moment when a Roman soldier thrust a spear into his side? Was this wound the final blow that caused Christ's death? Some have thought that the description of blood flowing from Jesus' side indicate that he was alive at that moment. The premise being that blood does not flow from a wound in a dead body. The idea that blood cannot flow from a corpse is not necessarily true, however. A large clot, such as could develop in the heart at the moment of death, may be unstable and reliquefy. Additionally, the effects of traumatic shock can impair the blood's usual clotting capacities. With a mandate that those being executed had to die before sundown, soldiers broke the legs of the others being crucified. They would not have hesitated to break Jesus' legs also. Roman soldiers were skilled in execution and assuring condemned prisoners were killed. We must therefore conclude that Jesus was unmistakably dead, but to assure absolute certainty, a spear was thrust into his chest wall, which collapsed his lung and ruptured his heart. Perhaps the most ubiquitous theory is that of asphyxiation or suffocation. Many popular-level apologetics books take this to be the case. Once a person is hanging in the vertical position, crucifixion is essentially an agonizingly slow death by asphyxiation. The nature of crucifixion virtually guarantees death from asphyxiation. While this theory is widely supported among experts, is there really enough evidence to back it up?
So before we let him continue, remember, what we're talking about now are some of the most widely used and widely discussed causes or possible causes for the actual death of Jesus. All of them are possible, but the question then becomes which ones are the most plausible, which ones are the most able for us to be able to point to evidence and say this is the most likely culprit to actually show that what actually happened here was death on the cross.
Suffocation is the interruption of the breathing apparatus. Asphyxiation is the term given to the effects of oxygen deprivation, which potentially can lead to death. Suffocation can cause asphyxiation. Anbindung was a type of suspension torture used during the Austro-Hungarian War, where victims were suspended with their arms tied overhead with their feet unsupported. With the force of their entire body weight being supported only by arms tied directly overhead, the victim's chest walls were expanded, restricting the ribs from moving normally. Regular breathing became impossible, and victims rapidly developed severe pain and muscle spasms. There are logical problems with suffocation being the mechanism of Jesus' death, however. Anbindung torture differs from crucifixion in that the arms were tied directly overhead and the feet were left dangling unsupported. In crucifixion, the arms were restrained to the side rather than directly overhead, and legs were supported by being nailed in place. Crucifixion could last for days, suggesting that breathing while on the cross was not restricted in any significant way. Jesus himself spoke with the others being crucified with him. It is counterintuitive to think that crucifixion victims could carry on a conversation if they were suffocating. Conversing during prolonged Anbindung suspension torture would be impossible. Dr. Frederick Zugabe performed an interesting reenactment experiment, placing subjects on a cross while monitoring their vital signs and blood chemistry. All subjects maintained normal arterial pH and oxygenation throughout the experiment. Subjects fastened to the cross only by their arms with their feet dangling unsupported had severe arm pain, but their breathing was unaffected. It is almost certain that crucifixion victims were not able to pull themselves up with their arms. The primary muscles flexing the arms are the biceps brachii. With the body leaning forward and the arms outstretched on the cross, the biceps muscles would be elongated and at a mechanical disadvantage. In a stretched or elongated position, the biceps muscles would also have diminished contractile capability. The notion that crucifixion victims had to push and pull themselves up on the cross to keep from suffocating finds little empiric support. Theories like...
So that right there is going to be one of the parts of the article from the medical journal that is being challenged. So that's a good thing for some of you. Maybe you want to talk about, maybe you've got a different opinion, but that's a good challenge. And I like the fact that there are people actually working through this material to make sure that we are seeing the best evidence possible.
Cardiac rupture, a fatal spear thrust, or even suffocation don't seem to account for the evidence. There is, however, one more option that, upon close examination, could be our most likely candidate: shock. In medical science, shock refers to the effects of decreased blood perfusion and oxygen delivery to cells within the body. Traumatic hemorrhagic shock is caused by decreasing circulating blood volume, hypovolemia, as a result of injury and bleeding. That Jesus suffered traumatic hemorrhagic shock is suggested by the descriptions of his torture and execution. The heart beats faster and blood vessels in the body constrict, compensatory mechanisms by which the body seeks to maintain blood pressure and increase blood return to the heart. Extreme thirst can occur during shock as well. The human body can compensate for modest blood loss. However, shock can occur when blood loss surpasses 10%. At 45% blood volume loss, reduction in blood return to the heart and decreased resistance in the body's blood vessels will cause the blood pressure to drop to zero. There is a point beyond which blood pressure cannot fall without eventually causing death in spite of the best medical treatment. The effects of shock are many. Cardiac function can become impaired, blood vessels do not function properly, inadequate oxygen supply can cause cellular death, leading to widespread inflammation and toxic chemical effects. Acidity develops within the body. The effects of shock are many and each one serious, all the more when multiple effects occur simultaneously. Even more dangerous is the amplification of shock through a snowball effect called a positive feedback loop. That is to say, shock causes more shock. The body's first defense against bleeding is for blood to clot at the site of injury. A dangerous possible complication of shock is that blood can lose its normal ability to clot. This has become known as trauma-induced coagulopathy. It is present in 1 in 3 trauma patients admitted to emergency departments and carries a markedly increased risk of death. Trauma patients admitted to emergency departments are 4 times more likely to die if coagulopathy is present. Causative factors that trigger coagulopathy during trauma are tissue injury with bleeding, hypothermia, and acidemia. With diffuse injury and widespread activation, the blood clotting mechanisms, necessary blood cells, and chemical factors can be depleted and cause an imbalance between the blood's ability to clot and dissolve unnecessary clots. This is detrimental amplification of the body's natural process of dissolving unneeded blood clots just when the blood's ability to clot is needed most. That is to say, the body shifts to dissolving clots abnormally when it should be producing more clots where needed instead. Hypothermia, decreased core body temperature to 36 Celsius or below, impairs blood coagulation. In the human body, a decrease in blood temperature slows the activity of enzymes associated with blood clotting. Another insight.
Okay, I know that's a lot and he's not done, but I also want you to think about this. If the ability to clot has been taken away, if the blood is not going to clot the way that it's supposed to, this also could have accounted for the separation of the blood cells and the blood plasma, or the liquid part of the blood versus the solid parts of the blood, the actual cells, so that when the spear punctures into the lung area, the pleural cavity, all of the fluid that would have gathered there, the fluid that was closer to the ground, gravity would have pulled those solid elements, the cells, further down lower than the actual liquid elements or the plasma. And so when the side was pierced, what you would have actually seen would have been that heavier material, that darker red material, the red blood cell filled liquid would come out first, and then the clearer material, or most of the pleural plasma, would have then come out afterwards, thus giving the appearance of blood and water flowing.
Factor that contributes to coagulopathy is when the blood becomes acidic, called acidemia, decreased blood pH, which makes the blood more acidic. The process leading to this is called acidosis. Like decreased temperature, acidity in the blood slows the enzyme activity associated with clotting. Trauma-induced coagulopathy is an ominous potential complication of traumatic hemorrhagic shock and markedly increases the risk of death. The greater the tissue injury and bleeding, the greater the risk. Acidemia and hypothermia are also triggering factors and common during shock. When tissue injury with bleeding, acidemia, and hypothermia occur simultaneously, they create a positive feedback loop of progressively worsening coagulopathy. This has been called a lethal triad. Trauma-induced coagulopathy is difficult for physicians to treat in the best modern trauma centers. In Jesus' time, death would have been certain and rapid. Thirst from hemorrhagic shock is the result of decreased blood volume, hypovolemia. This stimulates thirst centers in the brain by 2 separate mechanisms. Pressure sensors in arteries, baroreceptors, react to decreased blood volume and trigger thirst centers in the brain. Decreased blood flow to the kidneys will activate the renin-angiotensin system, a hormone system that regulates body fluid and blood pressure, and also stimulate thirst centers in the brain. Literary references to thirst during crucifixion describe a maddening agony. When Jesus said, "I am thirsty," it was almost certainly as a scream. The environmental conditions were present for Jesus to develop hypothermia. Sympathetic nervous system activation caused him to be anxious, sweaty, have a rapid heart rate, and cause blood vessel constriction. He would have been cold and clammy. Jesus' clothes were taken from him at the crucifixion site, leaving him exposed to the ambient temperatures. Temperatures were cold in the early morning hours after Jesus' arrest. Peter followed the temple guard with Jesus to the palace of the high priest. He stayed some distance away but tried to monitor what was happening. Yet it was cold enough that Peter lost his hesitation and joined the temple guard to warm himself by a fire. Average temperatures in Jerusalem during the first week of April ranges from 8 to 20 degrees Celsius, 46 to 67 degrees Fahrenheit, but can drop as low as -1 degree Celsius, 30 degree Fahrenheit. It was cold the day that Jesus was crucified, hanging naked on the cross in cool ambient temperatures, sweaty, and with arms and legs cold due to blood vessel constriction from the effects of blood loss, make it likely that Jesus was hypothermic.
Now, yes, we can also bring up questions about the actual time and date. He said April there, and we can kind of question a little bit of that, but the time of year is fairly close, even if April isn't the exact month.
Lethal triad of causative factors for trauma-induced coagulopathy were present, namely tissue injury with blood loss, acidemia, and hypothermia. Without objective medical data such as laboratory and hospital records, the mechanism of death cannot be known with absolute certainty and may have differed among crucifixion victims. Suffocation as the mechanism of death with crucifixion is untenable, however. Spontaneous cardiac rupture as a cause of Jesus' death is implausible as well. Shock is the most plausible explanation for Jesus' death. Trauma-induced coagulopathy was a possible contributing factor and may have hastened his death. Forensic pathologist and medical examiner Frederick Zugaby agrees, stating that the cause of death was cardiac and respiratory arrest due to hypovolemic and traumatic shock due to crucifixion. The description of Jesus' execution written by ancient observers without medical education can be explained as consequences of traumatic hemorrhagic shock. From a medical perspective, the gospel accounts of Jesus' death appear genuine. In a somewhat macabre statement at the Last Supper, it's as if Jesus seemed to say that the mechanism of his death would be exsanguination. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins."
So, whether you agree with all the conclusions or not, the issue is actually quite simple. Do we have enough evidence, historical, medical, to say that Jesus actually died on the cross? I would say that I believe that we do. That is the important question, because without death, we don't get resurrection. So, as I leave you, you have many different things in front of you. The video we just watched, you've got the articles in front of you. There's obviously some things that can be questioned and should be questioned, but take a look. Talk amongst yourselves, talk with each other. How much of this resonates with you? The coming to the Lord's table, as we do when we get every Easter, when we read about the Last Supper, when we read and when we share in communion. It takes on a whole new meaning when you actually start to think about the actual death of Jesus and what he went through. We didn't touch on any of the spiritual implications about what it means for Jesus to be on the cross and to be, as the Bible says, becoming sin for us. That is a discussion for another time. But tonight, the big question is, did Jesus actually die? I believe that with all of the material we have, we can say fairly certainly, yes, Jesus did die on the cross. So all of the theories that come up about it wasn't really a death and he didn't really die and maybe he swooned and maybe it was a twin and maybe it was something else, none of that holds any water really when you look at it from the point of view of all of the evidence we have, both the historical and the medical material. But talk about that with the group, and I will see you again next week. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful night. God bless you all.